Okay, so there's literally no difference or no break between the last one, but just for the sake of organization, I broke it up. So we just baked the whole maps really quickly, went over the ID stuff, make sure it was working okay. Seems all right. I'm pretty happy with the results of this. This seems like it baked the way I wanted it to bake, so that's great. So next step of the process is actually covering this. So I have my materials up to the right here. It's not really relevant for the video, but if you have all this installed properly, which I'm assuming you do, all we're going to be working with here is SoMuchDiffuse. It's this material, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and just move this off the screen just so we can see more. And then I'm actually going to, if you actually hit F1 through F3, F1 is split view, F2 is just 3D view, F3 is just the UV. I'm going to go do 3D view because it's way better looking. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the SoMuchDiffuse, just drag it into my layer stack, and it's going to apply it right off the bat. And then what I always do is I switch, if you hit C, you start cycling through, it turns on base color only. With hand painting, you always want to make sure you're viewing the truest form of that. So, or the truest form of your actual base color, right? So you don't want any outside lights. You don't want it, being affected by the normal map. In our case, we probably could turn the normal map on because for my game, I'm going to have the normal map on plus the diffuse. But in this case, I always just like to view what it looks like with just the diffuse and the diffuse alone. So, so two things I'll do. I'm going to go ahead and actually copy two of these, copy it once, because one of these is going to be my wood. I'm going to group it. The other one is going to be the metal. I'm going to group that as well. Oops. For the time being, we're just going to work on the wood. Excuse me. Apologize if my naming conventions always seem goofy and pretty sloppy when it comes to that, so I just don't really care a whole lot about what my names come out to be. Okay, cool. So at this point, we can start just going through what we're working with. So if you actually click on the layer that SoMuchDiffuse is applied to, it opens up this guy right here. We don't really care if the normal's coming through or not because it's not applied to it, but we do care about everything from parameters and onward. Actually, just parameters in this box. Everything, the meat and potatoes of this whole thing is actually in here. So for starters, you can do a preset. This is just something the devs of this started out with, and I think it starts out with base neutral by default, but as you go down, you can see that it changes the properties of this, so to speak. And again, everything you're seeing here is flat lit, which right off the bat, I'm sure you can see why this is such a powerful program or material, because this looks like it's being lit right now, but it's not. Go through Dota, we can do metal. This looks so dope. So we're working with wood right now, right? So let's go ahead and try to just apply a neutral one, because I don't want it to be too shiny. Let's do fabric, maybe. Fabric's a bit softer, and wood no, I lied. I'm going back and forth a lot. That's just my creative process, though. So let's go back to neutral, because I actually kind of want the wood to be just a little bit, have a little bit of a sheen to it, and let's just grab a wood color that we're gonna dig here. So I kind of want a washed out brown, or almost kind of like a gray, but we might want to push the red just because it's going to complement nicely with the bluish metal I'm thinking about doing. Kind of this maroony color. Just a little bit. Shadow color, I'm going to go ahead and actually change to the same thing. Let's grab like a deeper maroon and kind of wash it out of just a little bit more. And as you kind of drag on and off the shadow, you can see that the shadow is being turned off. And something I'm actually going to do for you guys, I'm just going to just turn off all these extra settings that I can for the moment, just so I can kind of go through one by one with what I'm doing here. Turn off the gradients for cavity, turn off the top down, don't care about that, turn off AO, turn off thickness, that's already off. We want to override, turn off the bake lighting override. So if I actually were to turn this off, yep, okay, so you can see this right off the bat. This is just, I gotta stop saying that phrase, goddamn. You can see right away that this looks so much flatter now, right? Which is normally in PBR we kind of want this not terribly flat, but we want this pretty neutral base color. But again, we're doing hand painted, so we want to try and get that lighting information big because that's so important. So I'm gonna try and maybe go for like a bluer tone on this actually. Dang, that's really dark. Man, because you don't want to go too dark, because if you go black, it's just ugly, right? You always want to avoid black. So usually when you're doing shadow, it's just a cooler version of what you're working with. But I kind of like to do some hue shifting usually, make it a bit cooler. So let's actually bring up the coolness on this, because this cart is cool, dude. And you know, I'm gonna stick with my gut. I kind of like this green one, this like greenish yellow one. So let's stick with this, made it a bit more desaturated. And then as you play with the shadow spread, if you go to the left, it's totally off. Go to the right, the whole thing is shadow. Oops, all shadow. So this controls the amount of shadow, right? Basically, your lerp of that, if you're familiar with the phrase lerp, or your shadow spread. Kind of imagine this invisible bar from here to the top of your mesh, the tippy topmost pixel to the very bottommost part of the mesh. That's your spread. Just kidding. I think that's the way the shadow kind of creeps out all over the thing. I'm sorry, I'm understanding that incorrectly. So you can kind of see the effect if you play with it. I learned this whole thing just by literally sliding dials back and forth until I went crazy, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's how all this stuff works. So I don't usually go too crazy with this. I usually just keep it at default values, everything for here. You want your cavity on, but we really got to change the cavity. I definitely don't want it to be that. I kind of want a dirt color because this is going to be dirty, right? Don't want the cavity contrast to be too high. So something, I'm going to dial it back just a little bit. Oh, hello. So this just softens up your cavity, it looks like. In some areas it looks okay. So let's say if it's off. If it's on, it looks kind of good in these other areas, but the second you turn it off, it looks kind of shitty right there. So I would just say for the time being avoid this, and then kind of focus on these other settings. Like again, trying to pick, okay, what's a color that I want for my dirt or something like that. And I might try to avoid the sameness of all the different colors because it's wood we're talking about. So maybe if I ooh, I like how desaturated this. So also to provide some context, based on the reference sheet I'm going for and the colors I'm thinking, I really want to kind of do like a washed out kind of desaturated feel to the whole environment. I think I might cheat a little. Well, not cheat. I think I might break the rules just for the objects that are important to you as the player in the VR space. But I'm pulling my references here. Yeah, because if you look at these woods, they're like really faded. They're really old. They don't really have a whole lot of, you know, vibrance to them, so to speak. Like this to me is a lot more vibrance in the wood, and I kind of like that shovel reference right here. It's really, really pale almost. It's almost just kind of like a really, really light beige. And it just feels a bit more washed out. And so it seems like it blends in with the environment. But in this case, we kind of want it to pop just a little bit because you want to be able to identify the important assets in your field of view, correct? So in this case, I'm going to actually bump that up. So I'm going to stick with the color that I actually had. So I'll make it a bit more red. So I'm happy with this color. You want to make sure the clipping doesn't go too low because it's going to start clipping outside of the bounds of the cavity. If it's too high, it just cuts it off too low. So I would always err on the side of higher clip, just because it leaks too hard otherwise. And then I would maybe, yeah, you don't want the contrast because the contrast is pretty low to begin with. The blur seems to be a nice friend. So if you do just a little bit, it'll kind of bleed, and then maybe dial it back like that. What's really odd to me is this isn't coming through right on top of this. So that's kind of frustrating, but I think we'll be okay just because, again, the nice thing about this is what we're seeing is what we're getting with the base color, which means you can always, always, always paint it out, right? So I'm going to stick with that because I can just come in here later and just boop, grab a color grab and lay down that cavity really quick, and then match it with the rest of the pieces of wood, and then move on from there. So look at that. So I guess I'll kind of cover my first trick that I do personally with this. So as you're seeing here, the cavity, I'm sorry, not the clipping, the world space intensity is really having an effect on this particular board, but the rest of them are getting blown out in the process. Like, this just looks like ass. Like, this is way too stark, and it looks really chunky, and so not good chunky. We want that good chunk because it's stylized, but it just looks like you grabbed a hard brush, went do 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 do, and just dropped a bunch of lines on it and called it wood. With this one, it looks quite a bit better actually, and even actually, in my opinion, I might drop it back just a little bit more. That's funny, even with this all the way back, it's still. So I'll drop it back a little bit more, and then onto this trick I'm talking about. So it's really affecting this middle one right here, but nothing else. So what I'll do here is I'm gonna come down to my layers, and then let's just duplicate it. So we'll call this wood middle board. And so what I'll do now is I'm going to mask it inside of this. I'm just grouping it, but it's important to try and nest your stuff, because you can like basically mask off sub masks, and it's pretty powerful if you learn how to actually mask properly. So from here I'll actually apply a black mask, and then I'm going to go ahead and just grab this guy right here, the polygon fill. And again, what's so cool about this is, since I'm doing my own low polys, I can actually just select it. So I can select the individual low poly itself. So what I'm going to do really quick is, maybe you guys might be catching on, go to cavity. I'm going to increase the, drop off the world space intensity. Actually, this is a really good side-by-side comparison. So all I'm saying is, in this layer stack, anything that's white on this black mask is going to come through. And anything that's not is just not, it's going to be completely avoided or just not even accounted for. So you can, what I'm shooting for is I'm trying to match up this board with the rest of this, and by dialing in a few settings, right? So I'll come over here. I'm going to keep going, make sure I select these. I'm going to get all of those pieces. So you may not see a huge difference sometimes. And if you hit X, you can toggle whether you want it to be black or white. Yeah, so it really only seems to be a huge difference on top. And in this case, sorry, I got to keep shoveling these up and down. Usually I have multiple monitors so I can keep all this stuff on them, but I want to make sure you guys can see what I'm working on. So with the cavity contrast, I'm sorry, I keep losing my spot. World space intensity. So that's where it's coming through a lot, is right here. Maybe if I increase the nope, don't want to do that. Blur, I want to blur it more. There we go. So it's not like totally perfect, and I definitely am seeing some disparities between the two, but for the sake of just moving forward, I'm going to keep doing that. Now, having some foresight in how this works, I'm actually going to turn this, or just completely toggle this layer off, because you want to try and make these special edits after this whole parameter stack has been finished editing, right? And you'll understand it in a bit, but it kind of comes down to your lighting conditions, because we're trying to fake baked lighting correct. So the way we do that is by playing with all of these like specular highlights and stuff. And when you end up changing that, and it's not propagating out to the rest of them, you're gonna have some issues with it. Now I can probably actually I can probably instance the material, which isn't a half bad idea, but I think having the separate materials would be a bit more control. So we'll come back to this, and I'll end up duplicating it one more time, and I'll do exactly what I just did. But the good news is we already have the mask for the middle board, so all I have to do is just copy the wood, duplicate it again, or sorry, copy it, paste it, rename it wood middle board, and then just copy the mask, place it into that mask, and then we should be good. Let me just go ahead and save this really fast. So moving on, We covered cavity. Happy with that cavity we have right now. Other gradients we have top down. This is pretty cool actually. So this basically says, like, in a lot of stylized materials, you have this thing where it's a top down gradient. I know in characters, like, for example, you want to have, you know, their feet area pretty dark because the main focus of the character is usually their head, their shoulders, or like their hands, you know, things that are mainly the main interest points. So we can control this by having a top down gradient spread. Um, you could do world space lit. I think top to bottom's a little bit better personally. And just to show you guys, just to exaggerate kind of what's going on, this is now the thing you can think of to where it takes the uppermost point and the lowermost point, and it says, okay, these are the bounds for my gradient. Here's the bottom, here's the top. And then as I increase the spread or decrease the spread, it's going to essentially slide the middle of that gradient up and increase or decrease the intensity. So in my case, I'd like to do this because I think it's pretty dope. So I like that. Now, this is where things, again, get pretty interesting with my particular scenario, and honestly anybody's scenario, depending on if they're going to have moving objects, if they're in VR, if they're going to see these from different angles. This is not going to be a static prop at all. This is going to be rotating when you move it forward or backward, right? So something I want to avoid is trying to paint it or like have very obvious areas as if they were painted to be in a specific location. So like this may look good now because it's just sitting still, but if this were to just sit down and start moving, as the wheel rotates, this darker green area is going to rotate to the top, and you're going to see this really dark spot, and it's not going to look good. But these are static, right? So these can stay here. So something I will do, probably in another pass with the same board right here, is I'm going to actually eliminate this gradient. Or I would do another pass where I like kind of compensate for the fact that there's a moving object, and I will try to eliminate the lighting as best as I can. Now, it's tricky because when you're working with round objects that are moving in circles, excuse me, you want to try and essentially paint them so they still look kind of round. So there is still some lighting information because you want like metal highlights to catch and you want edge highlights to catch. But it's tricky because certain things like wood grain, for example, you need to pick one direction and stick with it in terms of light. So in this case, I'll be sticking with what I currently have, where I want this to be facing up and this top part to be facing down. So it's they're tough calls you have to make in this process because it's hand painted, but it'll just kind of produce a much better result in the end. So so I like the way this looks though. Maybe make it a bit more green. Ugh. Dial back the saturation maybe. This is really weird. I literally just saved this. Huh. Interesting. It's telling me the save is failing. Why? What the hell? File, save as. Alright, well. I guess that's being strange. Okay, so. I'm digging this. I think this looks nice. I kind of like that blue look to it, but let me make it a bit more turquoisey. Yeah, kind of like that. And again, you just want to try to focus on complementary colors and focusing on your color wheel. So, as I bring it more towards red. Yeah, I like this turquoisey color. And again, I will try to dial it back on the wheel when I get a chance here. You can also do a select your own gradient, which I think is pretty neat. So this one, so FB means front to back, top to bottom, left to right, world space left to right, world space top to bottom, world space front to back. You can kind of play with those settings. In my case, I don't feel like I really need to have a focus on it, but why don't we go ahead and do front to back, and then actually no, I don't really care for that. I'm gonna turn this off because I don't really care for front to back or top to bottom. But essentially, what you can do is if you want to manually override this top-down gradient, or kind of stack your gradients, you can. So I could also do like a top to bottom thing where I have another layer of gradient. But in this case, I don't really care for that. So we'll turn that off. AO, we definitely went on the L. Look at that. Instantly made this thing look so much better. Digging that. I actually really like the blue that came through here. Make it a bit more turquoisey to match the worn look. I'm going to keep it at 4.56. Yeah, this looks really nice the way it's at. So I'm going to keep this guy. Because you want some nice color contrast going on. Because this is definitely reading as being lit, even though it's not. Thickness is a little strange. Oh, actually kind of creates some really nice edge highlights on the wood if you're kind of catching that. Let's see what I can do here with that. Maybe to my advantage. I think this might be a good way to fake subsurface scattering. I don't do characters at all, so correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, you see that like really cool effect it's getting on the edges of the wood. I kind of really like that. It's hard to see without the metal being on and masking out the metal, just because. It gave a lot more life to it, didn't it? I like that. Happy accidents. We'll take this. I like the effect of this, even though this is super pale. What's cool too is that if you actually work your way from desaturated to saturated, or like, you know, dark to light, things tend to take form a lot easier. I know a lot of other artists tend to say that as well, but I know I didn't set out to intentionally do that, but I'm glad it started out like that, because now that I've seen this what it looks like when it's saturated, it makes it look like it has so much more color and life to it. So, and there's still desaturated areas to it that make it appear dark. So I'm really digging this. I'm going to keep it. And then you can actually go ahead and just collapse this whole gradient section. So we can move on to Specular. This is where you're going to get your lights. So I don't know if you remember earlier when I actually turned everything off, and we want to make sure we actually turn something back on, which is going to be your override for used bake lighting. That's going to be super important because it actually turns on the light effects. Now this is wood, so it's not really shiny. So you're not going to see as much of a cool effect on it right here. But when I get to the metal section, I'll show you what this does, because it makes it look a lot better. So instantly just crank this down. Maybe just have it a little bit on. Actually, let's turn this up so you can see what the exponent does. So the exponent, I think, sharpens up the way the light kind of diffuses across the surface of the material. So the higher the exponent, the more sharp the highlight. I think. I'm not much of a technical person, so I apologize if I'm saying this wrong. But I do like some of the grainy effects of this. And I think one of the cool side effects of this program, or this material, is that if you get pretty close, it actually produces a lot of grain. And I like that because it adds a lot of texture to the texture, right? So that's kind of neat. In this case, I'm working with wood, so I want to make sure it looks like a wooden highlight. But I'm trying to think of the environment this is going to be present in. So I'm going to be in a moonlit environment. So maybe we'll meet in the middle and just maybe still make it look like it's wood or edgeware on the wood, and then maybe just dial it back and desaturate it. It's a little intense still, though, in my opinion. So let's turn back the specular intensity. So it helps define the edges. You want to be really soft and subtle with them. Yeah, definitely like that high exponent. So for my initial first look, I'm actually kind of happy with how this is looking so far. Oh, hey, one more cool thing. So this is your specular like light setup. This is pretty tough to visualize, in my opinion, because this highly depends on the orientation of what you're doing. I always work pointing down Z and face, and the side is always positive X. Yeah, like this. So I don't know if this is going to... This is essentially saying, like, what is the height of your light? But it gets confusing to me because I tend to visualize it in almost like it's like circling around your prop because of the way that this is. So this is something you want to try and just dial in using your eyes, just because this can get a bit confusing at times. So this is a good point to basically sit down and say, okay, where do I want my light source to be coming from? How do I want it to be affecting me? I definitely want it to be coming down from the top, obviously, because this is going to be low to the ground. But I think to help maybe define some of the angles and kind of like circular objects and like nicked objects, like the corners and the sides of these woods, you're gonna benefit from having a bit of an angled lighting scenario. So I'm gonna try and visualize it. I'm gonna lift up my light to be here. Oh, and I maybe just do one light for right now and see how that affects it. Because I think that keeps your light in the middle. Again, it could just be kind of goofy though. I definitely want to be catching the edges. So let's stick with this angle. And then this, I think, is how it rotates around. I'm just upset because I don't really understand. I wish there was a way you can visualize where this light is actually sitting, but there isn't at the moment, unless I have an outdated version, which I apologize if that's the case. So you can kind of see how I switch up the lights. Look at these boards right here. If I stick with one light, look how asymmetrical it is. So let's try to stick in increments of 90 degrees and see what that does, right? 0. And then if I did 90, I have a hunch it's going to stick to one side. So that's this side. So maybe what does 270 look like? Excuse me. So yeah, it is to the left then. So let's stick in 180 or 0. So more of your definition is absolutely going to come from this, just because mine is, I'm more focused on it not being asymmetrical, but it's more of a symmetrical piece. It's definitely going to come from, let me actually just quit my Discord, sorry. It's definitely going to come from more of the middle. You want to focus on that symmetrical lighting scenario. So like I said, just play with this, get something you like, and then stick with it from there. You'll probably find pretty quickly that as long as your edges are catching, that's all that really matters. And even furthermore, there's actually, if you go under effects, I'm going to cover the edges in a second, so you can actually just pop out your edges a bit harder. But what's important now though is focusing on where your light direction is coming from, because when you start to have multiple materials and you're going through and you're actually setting this up over and over again, you can't have these lights in different locations. It's going to completely change the way that the material reads, because it's going to imply that there's lights coming from here and whatever. So you want to make sure that you can try and replicate that light direction. So if, let's say, you get to a different point in the process where you're doing this metal part and you're like, oh shit, like it looks better this way, it makes you come back to the wood and you change it. Now again, you can use your artistic eye and dial it in the way that you'd like to dial it in, but just be aware that it could be a bit jarring if the lights are all over the place. So there's that. I'm pretty happy with this. Let's go to AO. This kind of blurs out the specular. I like to have a bit of a sharper highlight. Again, that's just my preference. So this is cool. I think it takes into account where your AO is at, and then it actually will not use lights on it, which I find to be a little goofy. I mean, I wish it had a slider to try and dial it in, because even though there's AO right here, it's still exposed to the light, right? So you'll actually pick up on it. But I don't like how light it actually makes the whole thing overall. Oh, so you can dial it in just a little bit. So go like here. Let's make this like there. There. Okay, so I'm happy with that. So you can. So if you actually turn the AO is on, and you can play with a slider right here. You can actually affect how much of it's popping through. And I'm just looking at a particular. I would pick a point on this to just stare at and just see how it affects it. I'm gonna stick with it like 60 HOs. I like that a lot. So there's that. This obviously affects the spread of your AO. I'm gonna keep that default though. Cavity looks like that also affects the lights come in. Not really seeing a difference, so I'll just leave it as default. Sorry, default. And then edges. So this is gonna, you see a huge difference in this. So you can see it on, again, the edges of this. So this is where I think a lot of people make huge mistakes in stylized art. As I'm noticing a ton of different pieces lately, that people will just take the edges and just jack them all the way up. Because like, oh, it helps define, you know, the different shapes I carved in. But it ends up making it look really messy and not in a good way. I can't really describe the effect. Everybody has their own preference. To me, it looks like there's just a bunch of like spider web strung around it, but you want to avoid this effect. You want to be really subtle with your edges, right? So, again, sticking with kind of a wooden color, and then cranking up. So I'm wondering if there's a way that I can kind of blur out those edges. See, it stinks sometimes too because it only picks up on a few areas. So this is actually something that you could probably do yourself using a generator in a layer. Like just make a layer called edges, and you can actually create a, you go to like right click and do add, we'll do black mask, add generator, because you want to add the generator to your mask, and then hit click on generator, and then click on curvature, and you can actually do it based on edges and whatnot. And then you can actually kind of filter through these different settings and dial in your sliders to try and detect the particular edges you are looking for, right? So it might help you a bit more, because this looks cool, but it seems to be only affecting like visibly like these areas. So let's go ahead and delete this layer. I do like what it's doing to this. So if my edges are affecting that, I'll keep them on. So they are. So, and again, the coolest part about being, you know, hand painted, you could just come in here at the end of it. Once this is set up, we have some work to do still. So I'm just gonna straight up come in here and just paint that out a little bit more, because I like how subtle this looks, but maybe I don't like how sharp that is. So you can kind of pick and choose which ones. So the underlight's neat. Simulates what an underlight would be if you're like under, you know, say a fire, or I don't know, some like cool spectral thing. I'm going to use a heavy artistic interpretation here, and I'm gonna give it some light too, because you don't have to be. I'm not gonna make this terribly dark because it's VR, so technically you can flip this thing over completely. And since that's the case, I want to make it seem like there's a bit of light underneath it at all times, and that, you know, the really bright moonlight's coming down, shooting onto it, and actually reflecting of a particular color. And the purple looks gorgeous on this. It's like really like almost. It looks purple here, but it's more like this like really bright periwinkle. So I'm gonna have that shooting up onto there. Play with this a little bit. If I were to take a guess at what kind of layer style this is, it's probably screening over the top. I don't know if you guys are familiar with multiplayer screens and that sort of stuff, but I think it's probably screening what this is, because I would probably, yeah, drag that all the way up. So I'm going to meet in the middle and keep it like this. You can adjust the other light intensity, the glossiness of it. And the spread, obviously, to see how far it's hitting. In this case, it's hitting everything. I'm going to keep it really subtle. Well, not super subtle. I want it to be pretty obvious because, again, I already explained my reasoning. But yeah, I want to try and There we go. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that because then it keeps the the area I was looking at pretty heavily was this spot. I liked how defined the contrast is between the planes. It's like these are very much so visibly defined. And something I'll probably do in my hand paint is define these individual boards and give them distinct light definition, because that'll help kind of decipher between the different angles on this. But I feel like I lose some of that when the spread is pretty high on this. So I'm gonna check. So right here I liked the effect of it, but it was kind of eating away at this because I want this to be pretty heavily occluded. So it helps define the difference between, you know, the supporting wood and then the actual barrel itself. So what I'm gonna do is just crank the spread up enough to where it affects the bottom, because you can see it makes a huge difference on the bottom. And then another, again, important thing here is we want to make sure that we actually keep this gradient and we throw it onto the metal portions as well as this wooden middle board. So we've covered the underlight now. They have a cool cell shading effect. I don't do any cell shading stuff, so you guys can play with it. I don't know, it's kind of neat, I thought. This might be cool for like a retro FPS if you're doing like really pixelated chunky stuff, or if you're doing like some Legend of Zelda stuff. Like, that's kind of cool, but not my jam, so I'm not going to do it. So I can just leave it off. So this is kind of cool. I don't know if I've actually ever played with this. So the highlight clip seems to be working, but I don't really know what the contrast is. And again, the override is just going to come through pretty well. So I like this. It seems like there's a lot of colors coming through at the moment. I'm gonna have to do some post fixing on these edges, because it seems a bit odd to me that this is appearing to be a bit brighter almost, or just as bright as the inside, when this is clearly facing down and out. Well, not down, but like it's definitely facing down outward, and it's pointing down, so it should be a little darker. But I have a lot of AO pushing through here. So if we go back to material, we can also come back to you can also make, like, if I'm trying to do like a thing where it's just diffuse and normal only. So I can turn on my color, turn off height, crank the roughness all the way up because it's going to be there. Metalness is just going to be off completely, and then normal map's already on there. So this is kind of what it would look like in a lit environment, give or take a little bit. Then if I go cycle through here, so M for material, C to kind of cycle through all these. You can also just click on this. I really like this because you have your purples, you have some greens going on. They complement pretty well with these reds and oranges you're seeing. And then probably the next video I'm going to cover going over the metal really quickly, just so it's more about covering my process and talking through it again. This one is more focused on actually going over the actual SoMuchDiffuse shader itself. And then once this is all done, we'll go into the hand painting section. So I will see you guys in the next one.